who turned a wedding into an execution chamber, who wrote vows in poison instead of ink, and why would a dynasty be erased in a single night? The bells of Castile rang as if in triumph, their echoes spilling through narrow streets lined with cheering crowds. Inside the cathedral, light from 1,000 candles danced on marble floors strewn with white rose petals. Isabel of Castile, her gown shimmering like moonlight, placed her hand into that of Thierry of Burgundy, heir to one of Europe's proudest dynasties. The exchange of rings glittered like a seal of peace. Goblets lifted high, brimmed with deep red wine. For a moment, it seemed that centuries of war might finally end with a kiss. But only hours later, that wine turned to blood. The music of harps and viols faltered, crushed beneath screams. The scent of roses grew rancid, overtaken by the sharp tang of iron. Thierry collapsed first, his lips dark, his body writhing in front of horrified guests. Isabel coughed crimson into her trembling hands, her wedding gown drowning in red, where there should have been laughter. There was terror, where there should have been unity. There was death, and in the chaos, a single image burned itself into memory, a golden ring slipping from lifeless fingers, striking a goblet and sinking into the spilled wine. Metal and blood, vows and poison, all fused into one. This is no legend whispered in taverns. It is a tragedy recorded in Chronicles, a night that silenced the heirs of Burgundy and cast a shadow across Europe, a wedding that promised peace, remembered only as a curse. Stay until the end as we uncover how power, fear, and betrayal turned a celebration into catastrophe. And subscribe now, because the darkest secrets of Europe's crowns are yet to come. The union of Isabel of Castile and Thierry of Burgundy was never simply a matter of love. It was a bargain struck across maps, a treaty wrapped in silk and lace. Castile had bled from years of unrest, factions clawing at the throne. Burgundy stood proud and rich, its merchants and soldiers shaping the rhythm of Europe. Together, the two names promised a fortress of power stretching across borders. To the common people, it looked like a miracle, a bride and a groom. Two dynasties made one. Bells rang, banners flew, and for a fleeting moment, the air itself seemed lighter. Yet in the silence behind cathedral walls, not everyone prayed for peace. In Castile's courts, noble families exchanged glances colder than the marble floors. For them, this marriage was not salvation, but intrusion. If Isabel bore children, their blood would carry Burgundy's claim, influence, lands. Entire legacies could slip from the hands of Castilian lords into foreign palms. Their smiles at the altar were painted, their words rehearsed, but their hearts whispered treason. Burgundy was no safer ground. Thierry's name carried promise, but it also threatened the power of those who had thrived on endless conflict. War had made men wealthy, carved them estates, crowned them with military command. Peace would strip them bare. A bride from Castile was not a gift, but a shadow falling over their ambitions. To them, the clinking of goblets at the wedding banquet sounded less like celebration and more like the tolling of a bell marking their decline. Every step toward the marriage was staged with grandeur. Parades through torchlit streets, choirs echoing under vaulted ceilings, feasts where wine spilled like rivers. Yet for each jewel on Isabel's gown, there was a hidden dagger sharpened by envy. For each cheer raised in the banquet hall, there was a whisper lost beneath the music. The wedding was not only a ceremony, it was a gathering of rivals, each calculating what peace would cost them. Power, after all, is a jealous creature. It cannot be shared without suspicion. It cannot be offered without fear. Isabel's beauty and Thierry's youth might have inspired hope in the eyes of the people. But to the courtiers who sat nearest to the throne, they inspired dread. A dynasty reborn through their union meant a reshuffling of every privilege, every right, every inheritance. And for some, it was easier to imagine the marriage ending in tragedy than to imagine their own downfall. That is what made the night so dangerous. The cathedral glowed, the torches crackled, the air shimmered with music and wine. Yet beneath the surface lay a gathering storm. Guests raised their cups, but not all raised them with goodwill. Behind jeweled masks and painted smiles, the thought lingered. If one were to cut the thread of this marriage, the future could be rewritten. It is here, in the tension between candlelight and shadow, that the true story begins. Not in the vows spoken at the altar, but in the quiet calculations hidden in the crowd. The wedding promised peace to nations, but for those who had everything to lose, it offered something else entirely: the perfect stage for betrayal. And so, as the bride and groom stepped hand in hand into their feast, unaware of the eyes fixed upon them, the question no longer belonged to the future. It belonged to the present. Who would strike first? And how soon would the celebration unravel into ruin? The feast began with a blaze of light. Chandeliers dripped with wax above the vaulted hall, their flames flickering over gold-embroidered banners. Long tables groaned beneath roasted game, sugared fruits, and gleaming silver platters. Musicians filled the air with strings and flutes, their melodies dancing like sparks across the marble floor. Courtiers twirled in elegant circles, velvet sleeves brushing against silk skirts, while servants moved silently between them, refilling goblets that never seemed to empty. It was the picture of triumph, a kingdom's celebration painted in wine and candlelight. At the head of the hall sat Isabel and Thierry, their hands resting close, their smiles rehearsed yet tender in fleeting moments. To the crowd, they were the vision of hope itself, the bride's eyes bright with youth, the groom's laughter echoing with promise. Guests raised their cups again and again, toasting not only the couple but the peace their union was meant to bring. And yet, beneath the glow, shadows stirred. One servant lingered too long at the wine casks. His hands moved carefully, but his eyes betrayed him, darting left and right, restless as though weighed down by secrets. When he leaned over the goblets laid out for the next toast, his breath seemed to falter, his grip a fraction too tight. He poured as instructed, but in his hesitation lay a question no one dared ask: did he know what he carried? Across the hall, a Castilian duke watched with a smile that did not touch his eyes. His goblet rested untouched before him, yet his gaze never left the bridal table. When he leaned to whisper to the man beside him, the corners of his mouth curled in satisfaction, as if he alone understood how fragile the night's harmony truly was. His laughter was soft, measured, and chilling. Not far away, a Burgundian countess sat rigid in her seat. Her jeweled fan clutched so tightly, the bones of her hand showed white beneath her skin. She spoke little, but her silence spoke volumes. Her eyes followed every servant's step, every hand that reached for a goblet, every glance exchanged between rival factions. She seemed to know, or at least to sense, that the feast had become a stage where death itself lingered in disguise. The music swelled, dancers spun, and laughter rolled across the tables. But all the while, one cup waited. Its surface rippled innocently, red as any other, its fragrance no different from the rest. Yet inside it rested more than one. It carried the weight of ambition, the sum of whispered fears, the venom of those who could not allow the marriage to survive. Isabel lifted her goblet once to her lips, only to set it down with a smile as guests pressed her into conversation. Thierry's hand brushed against hers, steady and reassuring, as though to remind her that the night belonged to them. They did not see the servant's trembling fingers. They did not hear the calculated murmur of the Duke. They did not notice the fan that snapped shut with a sound like a blade sheathed. The hall glowed with beauty, but its beauty was brittle. Every toast was a risk, every sip a wager. And as the night stretched on, the question no one voiced coiled tighter around the room. When would the goblet find its mark? For now, the feast carried on, bright and magnificent, as though nothing could disturb it. Yet beneath the music and the laughter, tragedy had already taken its first quiet breath. The cup had been prepared. It only waited for the moment to be claimed. Whispers always travel faster than music. As the feast glittered on, so too did speculation begin to coil around the hall like smoke. Every smile seemed sharpened. Every glance suggested more than it revealed. The poisoned cup was not chance. It was design. And design always serves someone. In Castile, voices had long feared what Isabel's marriage might bring. She was their daughter, their blood. Yet in Burgundy, her children would be claimed by another dynasty. For Castilian lords, the thought was unbearable. Burgundy would inherit not just a bride, but a legacy, perhaps even dominion over Castile's future throne. To let Isabel remain in Burgundy meant allowing their influence to wither, their ancestral power to pass into hands across the border. If she were widowed, she might return home, restored to their orbit. Without heirs to bind her fate to Burgundy, the balance of power could yet be reclaimed. To some in Castile, poison looked less like crime and more like protection. But Burgundy itself was no innocent stage. Thierry, though beloved as heir, carried rivals at his back. A cousin stood waiting in the wings, his claim weaker in law but stronger in ambition. Powerful nobles, fattened on estates and titles, had everything to gain if Thierry's line ended before it began. For them, the wedding was not salvation but obstruction. As long as Thierry lived, their futures were chained. But if his breath faltered, if Isabel's womb carried no child, then their path to power would be cleared. 2 courts, 2 motives, 1 poisoned cup. The challenge for history is not to decide whether enemies lurked, but to ask which of them struck first. Was it Castile, desperate to pull its daughter back from foreign soil, fearful of her children one day ruling them from afar? Or was it Burgundy, reshaping its own destiny by removing the very heir meant to lead them? Every guest knew the truth lay in a single cup, but no one dared to name it. And so the banquet carried on, draped in music and laughter. Even as suspicion thickened the air, the Duke's quiet smile seemed to know more than he admitted. The Countess's trembling fan hinted at secrets she would never voice. Servants bowed lower than usual, their silence heavier than any oath. For those seated closest to the bridal table, every swallow of wine was a gamble, every toast a question. The goblets glittered like jewels, yet each shimmer carried menace. Courtiers raised them high, but their eyes lingered on Isabel and Thierry, waiting for the moment when the poison would reveal its master. The tragedy of that night lies not only in the deaths that followed, but in the uncertainty that endured. Centuries of chroniclers would debate, yet none could write with certainty the name of the hand that poured the venom. What remains is the stark truth that power always leaves a trail of blood, and dynasties are as fragile as glass. As the candles burned lower, the hall seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. The poisoned goblet had already been touched. What no one knew was whose lips would seal the fate of nations. The first sign was so small it almost passed unnoticed. A cough, sharp and brief, swallowed quickly by the swell of violins. Thierry pressed a hand to his chest, brushing it aside as if it were nothing more than the dryness of too much wine. Guests laughed, musicians played on, and the feast continued its rhythm. But then his goblet slipped. It struck the table with a hollow ring, red liquid spilling across embroidered cloth like blood already searching for flesh. Thierry's fingers trembled violently. His face drained of color, his lips darkened, and his eyes widened with the terror of a man who knows he is betrayed. The hall fell into a hush, broken only by the scrape of his chair as he collapsed to the floor. Isabel turned toward him, her veil trembling as she reached for his hand. Before she could cry out, a fit of coughing racked her own chest. She bent forward, gasping, crimson staining the lace of her gown. The white silk that had dazzled the hall was drowned in red, the roses at her feet seeming to bloom anew in the color of her blood. The sound was unbearable. Goblets crashed to the ground. Silver platters clattered as guests recoiled. Some shrieked, their voices echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Others sat frozen, their hands gripping the edge of the table, their eyes locked on the scene as if it were the fulfillment of a prophecy. The music halted, not with a graceful cadence, but with the jarring silence of strings cut mid-note. The harp's final vibration lingered like a dying breath, then vanished. Panic tore through the crowd. Servants rushed forward, their trays abandoned. Nobles stumbled back, spilling wine down their velvet sleeves. And yet among the chaos, a few faces remained still. They watched without surprise, lips pressed thin, eyes cold, as though they had long expected this moment. Their stillness was more terrible than the screams. Thierry convulsed once, twice, then lay motionless. His body sprawled beneath the bridal table. Isabel clutched her chest, her breath coming in broken gasps, her eyes darting wildly as she tried to rise, only to collapse beside him. Her hands reached desperately for the ring still circling her finger, as though that fragile band of gold could hold back death itself. The banquet was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a battlefield. Though no swords had been drawn, chairs overturned, gowns swept through pools of spilled wine, and the smell of roasted meats mingled with the metallic sting of blood. The wedding feast, meant to mark the birth of peace, now lay disfigured into a funeral pyre. Witnesses would later recall the silence that followed, not the silence of reverence, but the silence of fear. No prayers were spoken, no cries of comfort offered. Every guest knew the truth lay in a single cup, but no one dared to name it. To speak was to risk being marked as guilty. To move was to risk being accused. In that terrible pause, the image seared itself into memory. A harp abandoned mid-song, its strings shivering in the draught. A bride and groom entwined not by love but by death, and a hall once radiant now scarred forever by betrayal. The bells that had rung in joy hours earlier seemed to toll again in memory, this time not for union, but for the end of a bloodline. The banquet was over. What remained was ruin. The hall had descended into chaos. Yet around Isabel there was a terrible stillness, as if time itself recoiled from what it had unleashed. Thierry's body already lay cold beside her, his face drained of every trace of life, his lips parted as though caught mid-breath. She reached weakly toward him, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his embroidered doublet. But there was no warmth to answer her. Her own breath came ragged, pulled from her lungs in shudders. The lace at her chest was soaked through, red blooming outward like a second gown sewn from blood. With each cough, her body convulsed, yet her hand refused to let go of the golden band at her finger. The wedding ring, so recently a symbol of promise, was now the only anchor she clung to as her strength faded. Her eyes turned upward. Above her, the cathedral vault soared into shadows, frescoes of saints and angels painted on stone ceilings that seemed impossibly distant. She stared into that space as if searching for salvation. But the silence of heaven was deafening. The angels did not descend. The saints did not move, and the heavens offered no reply. Around her, the world pressed in with cruel indifference. The petals strewn along the aisles still carried their fragrance, but now it mingled with the metallic sting of blood and the sourness of fear. The roses that had lined her path to the altar hours before now seemed obscene, their perfume clinging to death as if mocking her final breaths. What had been a bride's adornment was now a shroud. No priest stepped forward to whisper prayers. No noble dared kneel at her side. Fear had sealed every tongue. To utter words of blessing was to risk suspicion. To show compassion was to invite blame. And so she lay in silence, abandoned not by faith itself, but by the cowardice of those who claimed it. Her body trembled once more, her lips forming a name that never reached full voice. Perhaps it was Thierry's, perhaps a plea to God, perhaps nothing more than the breath leaving her forever. Her grip loosened at last, and the golden ring slipped slightly on her finger, glinting as the candlelight flickered above her. In that instant, the great hall seemed to collapse into itself. The music had long since died, the laughter extinguished. What remained was the echo of her shallow breath, the rustle of fabric as guests drew back, and the final fall of her chest as her body grew still. Isabel's gaze remained fixed on the ceiling, her eyes glazed yet open, reflecting the vaulted stone above. The contrast was unbearable. Hours before, she had walked through this same space with flowers in her hair and vows on her lips. Now, the same petals lay crushed beneath feet scrambling for escape, and her vow was sealed not in life but in death. Where joy had lingered, despair now sat enthroned. Her passing was swift, cold, and unadorned. There was no hymn to guide her soul, no chorus of voices rising in lament, only silence, thick and suffocating, pressed upon the hall. Thierry and Isabel lay together, bound not by destiny fulfilled, but by a tragedy that erased it. The hall that had once roared with celebration now stood mute, the flicker of candles casting shadows long and distorted. A wedding had become a crypt, and in that crypt, the silence told a truth that no guest dared to speak. 2 lives had been extinguished, and with them, the hope of a dynasty. The cathedral emptied slowly, its grand doors closing on whispers rather than hymns. The feast had dissolved into ruin, and all that remained was the heavy air of betrayal. On the marble floor, the bride and groom lay side by side, their lifeless forms turning a night of promise into a monument of despair. Burgundy's hope, Castile's bridge, the future of two realms, vanished before dawn. Thierry had been the vessel of continuity, the heir meant to carry Burgundy's line into another generation. Isabel had been the promise of children who would bind kingdoms together. With their bodies struck down, the marriage gave birth to nothing. No heirs, no legacy, no thread for history to follow. In a single night, the Burgundy line found itself broken, its inheritance scattered like ashes in the wind. Isabel herself became a legend, but not the kind a queen would wish. The chronicles did not remember her as the radiant bride who carried peace across borders. Instead, they etched her image in darker shades, the bride of death, the young woman whose white gown turned red, the dove who fell from the altar before she could ever take flight. Her name became a symbol of endings rather than beginnings, a warning rather than a hope. In the archives of Burgundy, scribes bent over the book of genealogy. When they reached her name, their quills hovered, then marked it with a single merciless cross. No heirs would follow beneath her entry. No lines would extend into the future. The family tree lost an entire branch that night, consumed before it could grow. Imagine the book lying open in the firelight, the ink still wet, the flame in the hearth beside it crackling as though mocking the fragility of bloodlines. A single strike of poison had erased centuries of planning. This is how dynasties die, not always in battlefields drenched in mud and steel, but in banquet halls, under candlelight, with goblets raised in false celebration. The legacy of Isabel and Thierry is not one of peace, but of silence. Their wedding stands as a curse whispered across Europe, a reminder that power is never secure, that even the brightest vows can be turned into the darkest weapons. If one wedding could erase a dynasty, imagine how many royal vows were written not in love, but in blood and poison. Do not let these stories sink into forgotten pages. Stay with us, because behind every crown lies a secret burial, and behind every anthem, a silence carved by betrayal. Subscribe now, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden funerals behind the wedding bells.